All right, the next question will come right back to you, Senator Patrick.
Double spin.
Well, you get the first one on this time around. And we've talked about the third rail being Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and how it's untouchable. Let's talk a little bit about some specifics about how do we do it, how do you rally up some of the other U.S. senators on the Hill to make the change, the difficult changes on these entitlements?
I would approach it the same way I did in the Texas Senate. When I went there, the first vote I tried to pass was changing the 21-vote rule, and I lost 30-1. You have to stand alone and stand on principle. Eventually, people start to follow you. And so now, in the Texas Senate, I'm proud to say, a lot of senators ask, where's Danville? Because they don't want to be on the other side of someone who has been rated after 12,000 votes, the most or second most conservative, depending on the rating program. So what you have to do is go there and stand on principle. And you have to lead, and you must not yield. We spend about $792 billion in Medicare, Medicaid, about $703 billion on Social Security, $700 billion on the military. About 63% of our budget in the federal government are entitlements. We're going to have to cut. That's what we did in Medicaid in the schools this session. And how do you cut? It's real simple. We are a compassionate nation, and we should always take care of our veterans who are mentally or physically wounded, our disabled, our senior citizens in need, and our children. But if you're not one of those groups, get off your butt, get an education, and get a job, and get off the taxpayer as Republicans, we can reduce spending. 10 years ago, the budget was $1.8 trillion. Now it's over $3 trillion. We were able to live in this country on $1.8 trillion 10 years ago. We can do it again. We just simply have to learn to say no. And we have done that. Not as much as I'd like, but as much as I could get done in the Texas Senate. We have said no. So when it comes to looking who you want in Washington to be your U.S. Senator, you need someone who's not just going to stand up against the mainstream media, and not just against the Democrats, but against the Republican Party, and get them in line, and get them to reflect your values. Even though I'm not always the most popular senator on the floor, I have always put your interest first and the establishment's interest second. But I have proven you can still stand on principle, get things done, and not have to go along to get along. Thank you.
The same question, Mr. Cruz, talking about the third rail being the entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. How do you go about getting it done on Capitol Hill?
You're exactly right. For a long time, people have been terrified to talk about reforming entitlements. I'm convinced we're in a different time right now. I am campaigning openly and actively on fundamental entitlement. You can't get serious about the budget without addressing entitlements. 2/3 of our federal budget is entitlements and interest on the debt. Now, what does that mean specifically? I mean, let's talk specifics rather than just empty rhetoric. Social Security. Social Security, I think any serious reform on Social Security needs to do a number of things. Number one, preserve current benefits for retirees that are receiving benefits. They have received a promise, we have given them a promise, and we need to carry through on that. Number two, the retirement age when it was passed was 65, and life expectancy was 62. One of the simplest ways to significantly affect the long-term solvency of Social Security is to gradually increase the retirement age on Social Security so that people in my generation get it later in life, when you have time to plan, time to save, time to know that you're going to get it later in life. Increasing the age dramatically affects the solvency. Number three, right now Social Security grows based on the CPI rather than inflation. It grows roughly 1% more a year than inflation. 1% doesn't sound like much, but when you compound it, it has a massive impact in the long-term solvency of Social Security. I would have Social Security grow to match the rate of inflation, not to exceed the rate of inflation. And the fourth piece I would include is a personal account for every American who pays into Social Security, so that a portion of what you pay into is yours, it is your asset, you can build upon it, you can hand it to your kids, they can inherit it, and you can use that for opportunity to build towards the American dream.
Mr. Addison, the same question on the third rail, specifics regarding what you would do on Capitol Hill, who would you work with, and how would you get it done?
I'll try to work with anybody that would listen, and I think that there are more and more senators that are beginning to see that long way off here are the chickens, and they're heading home to roost, and we've got to face up to it. So there are specifics on my website. With regard to Social Security, I have proposed increasing the minimum age that you can draw it to 63 from 62. Nobody who's currently receiving benefits would have any effect on their benefits. Likewise, I have proposed that if you're going to retire in 2014, your initial check would be 0.75% less than what you think it's going to be today. If you're going to retire in 2015, it'd be 1.5%, and then 2.25, and then 3, and so on and so forth until over the next 24 years, it would be an 18% reduction. In exchange for that, you can work longer if you want to make what you think today. Your statement tells you we need to give people some options, but we have to face up to the fact that in 2036 or 2037, if nothing is done, all of a sudden benefits will be cut from $1 to about 76 cents, thereabouts. With regard to Medicaid, I propose that it be repealed as an entitlement, that it become a fixed budget line item based on what the revenue is, which means it's going to have to be, the criteria is going to have to be cut and tightened up approximately 1/3. There are federal programs that right now you can have 350% of the poverty wage and still qualify for these federal programs. That has got to be tightened up significantly. So that's my proposal. Furthermore, I know that Senator Patrick could probably give some horror stories, but right now, because the state is threatening to cut the state's contribution to Medicaid, the federal government is saying, you do that, you watch how much we cut you. Medicaid needs to be a grant program to the states with a little check attached that says, Dear State of Texas, attached is your share of federal Medicaid money. After verifying citizenship, use it as you deem appropriate for the individual citizens of the state. My website has details of my Medicare proposals.
Changing topics just a bit, and this question will first go to Mrs. Jones. This is regarding term limits. A couple of you have already mentioned your position there, so to Mrs. Jones, do you support term limits, and would you abide by self-imposed term limits?
Absolutely. I'm 54 years old now. I'll be 55. I don't want to be in the United States Senate so long that I can't come home and enjoy my grandchildren and a walk and a ride on a horse across this great country, this great state of Texas. I'm a daughter of Texas. I will go to the United States Senate and I'll serve 2 terms. And if I can't get done for you what needs to be done in 2 terms, then it is time for me to go. And of course that assumes that you even want me to go for a 2nd term. I'll be a strike force, and I'll get in and I will get out. And there'll be no house, there'll be no Jones home purchased in Washington, D.C. I want to be moving up there with my family. You're my family here, and I'll go, and I can't wait to come back home. Thank you.
Mrs. Pittenger, as a younger person, that's more years for you to serve in the Senate. What is your position on term limits?
Well, I believe in self-imposed term limits without a doubt. 2 at the most. And again, I agree with everybody else. If you vote for me after the first one, and I'm still serving your interests. But what I think we need to pay attention to and address is the fact that there's an entire arm of the government that has no term limits, and that's the federal bureaucracy. Even though we would cause a constant turnover of candidates and servants in the House and in the Senate, it will never change because the people that are the bureaucrats are there 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years. And I've heard them say again and again, it doesn't matter what you're going to do here. You'll be gone. I'll still be here. They have their long-term plan. I believe we need to address some method of turning the compost pile in the bureaucracy. I would call it out in West Texas when we walk around with the cattle and the horses. But I think that's what we really need to address. I think it's important that we deal with our legislators. But me personally, I believe that you have to give other people opportunities. You need at some point a business person, and you need at some point a person who's an attorney, and you need at some point a person who's a mediator, and you need at some point a person who's in the medical field or an educator. We need a constant rotation of perspectives because I'm sorry, no one person represents 30 million people and their lifestyles and their experiences and what needs to be done. If we deal with the budget in the next 2 and 4 and 6 years, we have other issues we have to address, like education and what's happening in this country. If we get beyond Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and defense, we're going to have to deal with things like the giant bureaucracy and the unlimited power some of these agencies seem to have, and the ability for them to raise their own money without even consulting the taxpayers. So I think that, yes, term limits for us, for all of us on all levels, but let's turn the compost pile and let's put a stop to the unlimited terms of those in the bureaucracy.
Mr. Leffert, on term limits, how would you avoid being persuaded to stay just one more term now that you've got that all-important seniority?
Well, I'm in favor of term limits, but I'll tell you personally, I don't think that's the right question. I'm a business person at heart, and nobody ever gave me a job and said, here's a time frame. They gave me a job and said, here's what you need to achieve. In Dallas, when I walked into the mayor's position, I identified very specifically things that we would accomplish. And in each and every one of those areas, we not only checked the box, but we exceeded those. We also need to understand the rise of the problems in front of us. The reality of it is that if we don't, in the next less than 9 years, address the issues on the fiscal mess of Washington, we're not going to address them. We will have so many baby boomers that retire towards the end of this decade that it will lock in the cost of those entitlements, and it won't make any difference what we do into the next decade. So we're working with a time frame that shouldn't be measured in terms of term limits. It ought to be measured in what you get done. And I will also tell you that part of my perspective, when Laura and I first got involved in running for mayor, we said if we weren't doing this tomorrow, we would be very happy. There's a lot of fun things that we go on and do in life. We thought we had an obligation and responsibility that was requested of us, and we accomplished that. And I view the Senate as being in the same way. And I can tell you my view is exactly the same. There are things we ought to accomplish. They ought to be measured in terms of those accomplishments, not in terms of time. I will also tell you that the perspective needs to be very different than it has been. We need to bring Congress into the view of what's happening in America. I have said publicly that the first piece of legislation that I would put in place, and I know I will lose on day one, we talked about earlier, but I will win at the end of 6 years, is that any benefit, pensions, health care, etc., for congresspeople and their staffs can be no better than the midpoint of the private sector, and any congressperson that's elected cannot lobby within 10 years of the time they leave office. You need to do those things. Not just dealing with term limits.